Bernie Sanders, we're just a couple of weeks away from the Iowa caucuses, and by most folks' accounts, ready to plunge into the political process, the process of electing a president here in the United States. You're mayor of Burlington, Vermont. From your perspective in that job, what kind of a person would you like to see as president of the United States?
Well, I would like to see somebody who has the guts to begin to stand up to the people who own this country, to recognize that in our nation today we have an extreme disparity between the rich and the poor, that elections are bought and sold and controlled by people who have huge sums of money. So my first concern is to have a president who has the courage to look reality in the face and say that we need some radical changes in this country so that every American can have the opportunity to have a decent standard of living and live a decent life. I also, when we talk about presidential politics, I always have a little bit of a problem because I'm not a Democrat and I'm not a Republican. In Burlington, Vermont, we have, I think, the only three-party system in the United States of America. My dream would be that we would have a strong third-party movement in the United States composed of working people and minorities and women groups and all of the people who are presently disenfranchised, though that doesn't exist right now. So my options are somewhat limited. But essentially, I would like to see somebody who speaks for the underdog, for the people who don't have decent health care benefits, somebody who understands that in America today 50% of the people don't even vote anymore, and the vast majority of that 50% are poor people and working people who have given up on the system. So essentially I would like to see a candidate who has the guts to have a vision that America could be a land for all people, not just a land controlled by the super rich.
Why did you get involved in politics in the first place?
Good question. I don't exactly know that I could give you the answer. I think it's kind of instinctual. You wake up in the morning, and even when you're a kid, and you look around and you see things that bother you, you see things that are stupid, that don't make sense, and you say, I want to do something about that. You know, I don't want to be a zombie and sleep through my life. I want to have an impact upon the world in which I live. And I really didn't grow up in a political family, and I didn't really become educated about politics until I went away to college. But then I did become involved in issues of war and peace and racial discrimination and so forth, and became involved way back in 1971 in Vermont politics, running on a third party. And I ran for governor and for senator on a total of 4 times, and I got 1% of the vote, and 2% of the vote, and 4% of the vote, and 6% of the vote, and finally, for a variety of reasons, I said, that's it. And I went about doing something else. And then back in 1980, some friends said, why don't you run for mayor? And I said, Burlington. I said, well, you're crazy. But they talked me into it, and I won by 14 votes, and then there was a recount that I won by 10 votes, and I've been reelected 3 times since. And,
how have you tried in the microcosm of Burlington to put that into practice?
Well, I think we've done a number of things. First of all, we created, for the first time in our city's history, a Community and Economic Development Office, which said that we're going to be aggressive and do everything that we can to provide decent jobs for our people. And that's not necessarily easy. But our CEDO office, we call it CEDO office, has done an extraordinarily good job in some conventional ways. They've gone out and they've managed to get 5 urban development action grants from the federal government, which is not insignificant. We've concentrated on building up small, locally owned businesses. And while the economy in Vermont is relatively good now, as it is throughout New England, we think we've done a little bit better than average, and we've created over 5,000 new jobs in the community. We've paid attention to the fact that, as I think most people know, women, everything being equal, earn less than men. So we managed to put through something that we're very proud of called a Women in Trades construction bill, which means that we mandated that private companies, construction companies, that are employing women will have to hire at least 10% women per job. And we're also making that effort in our own city government to get women involved in some of the blue-collar areas, which we think is very important. When you talk about women's rights, it means, to me, very importantly, economic rights, the right to earn a good living to take care of your family. So we've made some good progress on that. We've started what we call the Burlington Youth Employment Program. We have a lot of working-class kids and low-income kids who are having a difficult time learning the skills that they need to go out and get a job. We've started a good program. These kids are now rehabilitating some houses. They're doing gardening. So through a variety of strategies, I think we have done a good job. Our unemployment rate today is one of the lowest in the nation. And I think while our wage scale is still too low, we're making progress in raising it. So in fact, one of the things that I'm most proud of, actually, if you ask me, what am I most proud of, is that since I've been mayor in Burlington, we've come close to doubling voter turnout in our city. Almost twice as many people now vote for mayor. We have often 3 people running for Board of Alderman seats. There's a lot of excitement. There's a lot of interest. So to answer your question, yeah, we do try to take the issues to the people and involve them in the process. The answer is that I strongly believe that we need a third party in the United States of America, perhaps something akin to the New Democratic Party in Canada, a socialist-type party that would involve the unions, involve working people, basically a similar program to the Rainbow Coalition that Jackson is attempting to put together. We have done that in Burlington, Vermont. To some degree, we have, I think, the beginning of that effort in the state of Vermont. I ran for governor in 1986. I lost, but I got close to 15% of the vote, which is a good showing for a progressive third-party effort. In fact, it's, I think, as good as anyone has done in modern history. I think the potential is there. The obstacles are enormous because you need to build a party enormous sums of money, and almost by definition, a party of working people and poor people and minorities are not going to have that money. So to answer your question, I think it's possible. It's going to take long and hard, patient work. I think one of the areas that work could begin is on the local level. I would love to see cities throughout America emulate what we're doing in Burlington, having the guts to take on the Democrats and Republicans. You would be amazed, and I think the people would be amazed, at how little real support there is there for Democrats and Republicans. And if you stand up and you talk real issues and you try to represent real people, it is amazing how many people will come out and stand by you.
Education of its people.
Well, it's not that urban America is less concerned. It's that urban America is getting smashed by the Reagan administration, doesn't have the money to pave its streets or build its sewer systems or educate its kids. It's horrible. In some of the largest cities in America, 50% of the kids are not graduating high school. The cost of college education in this country is zooming up, so you have to be a wealthy person to send your kid to college. There was once a dream that my parents had and many people's parents had, that if you work hard and you go to school, you can get a college education. Mr. Reagan and his friends in the Congress have done away with that dream. So I don't think it's fair to say that mayors or school boards in America don't want the kids to get an education. They're dealing with enormous financial problems and the need to pump billions and billions of dollars into education. Give kids a reason to learn is very, very high up there in the agenda. And what we're doing is a travesty. Somebody told me an interesting story, actually, just the other day. And they told me that there's a Japanese firm, I think, intending to come to Vermont. And we are not any worse by any means in terms of educating our kids than the rest of the country. And the firm was concerned whether their kids could get the quality of education in our state that they get in Japan. But this has to do with priorities. If you're going to spend your money going to war against the people of Nicaragua, if you're going to spend your money on insane Star Wars programs and waste tens and tens of billions of dollars on the military and not put it into education, that's what you're going to get. First of all, let's talk about health care. And let's talk about the enormous crisis that exists in health care. And let's talk about the fact that the United States, along with South Africa, is the only industrialized nation in the world that does not have a national health care system. The cost of health care in Vermont is zooming upward as it is all over the country. Okay? What you have in our country, and I do not mean to condemn all doctors by any means, we have some wonderful doctors, but essentially you have medicine being practiced as a business. Okay? I think we need radical changes in the way healthcare is operated in this country. We got to have a national healthcare system like Canada. One of the things that we're doing in Burlington, Vermont is I appointed a task force to look at the issue of affordable healthcare. And one of the things that we did is we went out to Canada, we went to Ottawa, Canada, and we went to Montreal, Canada, and we looked at what they're doing there. I wonder how many Americans know that our neighbor to the north, Canada, which is a poorer country than we are, has a national health care system which guarantees full health care to all of its people without any, or almost without any, out-of-pocket expense. You get sick, you go to the doctor, you go to the hospital, you take your little card out. The cost of health care in Canada is escalating less than it is here in the United States, where it's going off the roof, because the government basically can control the cost. It sits down and negotiates with the doctors, it negotiates with the hospitals, and it says, we want you to keep the increase to the rate of inflation. In this country, it's going up 10% a year, 15% of the year. You have doctors and hospitals and drug companies which are making tremendous profits. So we need a radical change. Now, the point that this person makes, this caller makes, is, let me tie that to the whole issue of medical education, which he touches on. One of the problems that you have is that in this country today is that to get a medical school education, it costs you a huge sum of money. Tuition is $10,000, $15,000. So the average doctor is already $50,000, $60,000 in the hole by the time he or she graduates. You get married, you have some kids. What's the first thing you think about? You say, boy, I'm going to make a lot of money very quickly to pay back this debt. clearly what you need is something akin to Canada, where tuition is $1,000, $1,500 a year, where the government subsidizes it and says, we want quality doctors, and we don't want people who are simply going to be money grubbers.
Portland, Oregon, good evening. Your question.
Yes, hello. I want to thank C-SPAN so much for putting this gentleman on. I can't tell you how much I am interested in hearing what he has to say. I have lived in the United States for over 60 years. I've been interested in politics, and I'm completely disenchanted with our form of government. I don't believe anything worthwhile can change in politics because of big money controlling everything, and the fact that we can only have the two parties, which are so very much alike. And I say these things to my children, and they think I'm ridiculous. I'm wondering of the other countries in the world. If I were young, I would leave this country. That's how I feel about it, but I'm not. If you were young and you were going to another country, would it be Sweden, Denmark, Norway, New Zealand, or Canada, perhaps? I haven't heard everything you have to say, but I want to tell you I love every word, and I want to ask you if you think I'm disloyal in that I take and read the Daily People's World. Thank you.
No, I don't think you're disloyal, and I think that one of the problems that I hope to be able to touch on when we talk about big money controlling our society and the political process, and the fact that to run for president of the United States, you need to bring in $100 or $150 million, which, as we all know, by and large is going to come from corporations, and you're going to have to pay them back by doing the tax breaks and the other giveaways that corporations receive. One of the problems that we have is the media. And as I mentioned to you earlier in the program, I want to congratulate C-SPAN for being at least one channel where people have a chance to learn what's going on in the Congress and throughout the country, and I mean that sincerely. But generally speaking, what we understand is that the media, whether it's CBS, NBC, ABC, or the major newspapers in America, are owned by big money, and the concentration of that ownership is becoming significantly more severe. There's a wonderful book that I would recommend to the viewers called The Media Monopoly by a gentleman named Ben Bagdikian. And what he talks about, and it's quite incredible, is that the corporations, whether it's the Gannett Press, buying up more and more daily newspapers, independent newspapers around the country, or whether it's General Electric, which has just bought NBC, and as I understand it, is thinking about buying or part of buying CNN. Okay? What we're looking at is these huge corporations swallowing the book publishing firms, the movie houses, the magazines. And who is going to be talking, presenting an independent voice that is free of big money? And of course, the reality of that is that you have situations such as television, and the major function of television, by and large, is not to educate people, not to entertain people, but to bombard them every other minute with a 30-second ad selling them one product or the other. And all of television is geared not about important issues, but entertainment, and in fact, the news itself, very important issue. The news itself is becoming entertainment. So when we talk about big money controlling this country, it's not only the direct political process, but it's how we even learn about what's going on in this country. We're going, but I'll tell you this. If we look at what's going on in this world today, and if we understand that between the United States and the Soviet Union and the other powers, we're spending close to $1 trillion a year on weapons of destruction, okay, while hundreds of millions of people are starving to death, I think that people right now are feeling a little bit more optimistic, because at least after 7 years, Reagan is now beginning to talk to the Soviet Union. In Burlington, let me give you an example of something. Last spring, we have a group of people in Burlington who are part of a group called Project Harmony, and they are working very, very hard to create relationships between young people in the United States and Vermont and people in the Soviet Union. And last spring, we had some young people, the Leningrad Youth Choir, came to Burlington before a packed house in our Memorial Auditorium. And they got on the stage and they sang with Vermont kids. And the people in that room, probably 1,000, 2,000 people, were deeply moved. I think what people are understanding is that in the era of nuclear weapons, when we can blow up this world a dozen times over, at a time when people are starving to death, at a time when the Soviet economy is in shambles, we have a $200 billion deficit, that the insanity of war has finally got to end. Okay? And I'm proud in Vermont, I should tell you, that several years ago, our people in town meeting spoke up and they said we wanted a nuclear freeze. Dozens and dozens of town meetings, including Burlington, said, let's stop building more and more nuclear weapons. And all over the country, I think people are saying enough is enough. And I think perhaps out of that groundswell, which came in this country, came in the Soviet Union, they're beginning to talk. And I think the people all over the world are feeling good about that. I think the reality is that what's going on in America, and I want to go over this point because I don't know how many people out there are familiar with this point. Not only is the gap between the rich and the poor growing wider, but we have a situation now in the United States where the richest 0.5% of the population owns 45% of the wealth. Okay? That means the richest 1% owns more than half of the entire wealth of this country, and the other 99% of us share the other half. Okay? And that gap, of course, under Reagan has grown. The rich are richer and the poor are poorer. Second of all, there was an interesting story that appeared in the papers a few months ago, and it talked about the fact that while we have now several million people sleeping out on the streets, while the average standard of living for the average American worker has declined during the last decade, what we now have in this country, and the good news is, I suppose for some people, is we have a doubling of billionaires. So all of you who are billionaires out there are doing very well. We went from 22 billionaires, not millionaires, billionaires, to 41. So at the same time, we've seen a doubling, or almost a doubling of billionaires. We now have people sleeping out on the street. We have millions of minimum wage jobs being created which people can't live on. The woman seems, I'm delighted to hear that that woman's family is doing very well, and obviously there are many other people who are doing well. But I think for the average American worker, when you look at wage increases compared to inflation, when you look at the cost of telephone bills and electric bills and housing and health care and higher education, the average American worker is in worse shape. And the disparity between the rich and the poor is growing worse.
Albany, New York, good evening.
Yes, good evening. Good evening, Mayor Sanders. I'm from Albany, and I saw an article about you on Public Access TV here, and I wanted to say I thought it was great.
Thank you.
The reason that I'm calling, and I've got the TV muted out because I don't want it to holler or anything, but the reason that I'm calling is that you take a two-party system like we have, and someone who's a blue-collar worker in our country like myself with 4 children, and we look and we listen and we see that you're a socialist. We don't understand what a socialist is. I don't have time to sit down and read Wall Street or anything else that's going to tell me about that. I'm too busy working with 2 jobs. Could you tell me, is it feasible the 3-party system could work in this nation, that a Jesse Jackson could be elected with his kind of outreach to the people that are working, that are in need, yet he's black and they know he's black, but they won't bring that issue out?
Okay. Thank you very much for that question. Let me talk a little bit about Jackson. What Jackson has going against him is not primarily, in my view, is not primarily that he's black. I mean, there are some people who won't vote for somebody who's black, and that's that. That's a minority. And I think one of the changes, you know, if people think I'm dumping on the United States, let me say that one of the nice changes that has taken place in the last 20 or 30 years is that, in fact, a person like Jesse Jackson can run for president of the United States and be taken seriously. Who would have thought about that 20 years ago, a black person running? I think the issue is not a racial issue. I think it's a class issue. Okay? I think if you had a conservative black person, somebody, say, like a Mayor Good of Philadelphia, running, I think the business community would put money into his campaign and would say, boy, it's time for a black president. The real issue is not whether you're black or white, whether you're a woman or a man. In my view, a woman could be elected president of the United States. The real issue is, whose side are you on? Are you on the side of workers and poor people, or are you on the side of big money and the corporations? Jackson is on the side of poor people and working people. You know, interestingly enough, recently, we've celebrated Martin Luther King's birthday, and we had a ceremony, a very lovely program in Burlington, Vermont, as I'm sure people did all over the country. And I want those people who are as old as I am to remember Martin Luther King Jr.'s last years. Everybody today, all the editorial papers say, oh, wasn't Martin Luther King a great guy? He fought for racial justice, a great hero. Remember that a year before King died, when King spoke out against the war in Vietnam, and when King said we need billions of dollars to provide decent jobs, not only for black people, but for white people. And when King said, I am going to organize a poor people's march to go to Washington, of blacks and whites and yellows, but of poor people to demand justice. Suddenly, when Martin Luther King began talking that language and taking on the system, my goodness, the FBI was investigating him and tapping his phone. The President of the United States wasn't talking to him. The real issue in this country is class. And the ruling class and the big money people do not want to see workers wake up. They don't want to see workers voting. Now, this gentleman calls up, and the point that he makes is so poignant. He would like to learn about socialism. He would like to see if there's an alternative to the Democratic and Republican parties. Unfortunately, he's not going to see that on CBS or NBC and ABC. He's not going to hear about the possibility of an alternative to capitalism. He's not even going to learn about what goes on in Canada in terms of a national health care system, or the fact that they're now proposing, and I'm not, Canada is no utopia, you know, I don't want to suggest that. He's not going to learn much about the housing programs in Sweden or in Scandinavia, okay, because the system wants to keep us dumb and ignorant.
Linwood, Washington, good evening.
Yes, I have three quick questions.
Okay.
If socialized medicine is so great, why do the wealthy of the world, including the Shah of Iran, come to America for treatment? Second question, will the last living socialist in the world be from Vermont? And third, was Adolf Hitler a socialist?
Thank you.
Well, let's start backwards and work our way up. No, I don't think Adolf Hitler was a socialist. He was a national socialist, a Nazi, and presumably, I suspect, arguably one of the more horrendous human beings that has ever walked on the face of this earth. In terms of socialized medicine, why rich people such as the Shah of Iran can go any place they want to get the best health care that they can. And I would say that probably in the United States, if you're a millionaire, this country provides you with the best health care in the world. Okay? If I were a millionaire and I were living in Iran or any place in the world, I might well come to the United States. The question is, what happens if I'm making $20,000 a year and I can't afford the cost of health care? Where would I go? Well, then I'd have a lot of problems in the United States. 15% of our people have no health insurance whatsoever. The cost of Blue Cross, Blue Shield is zooming up. Doctors' bills are zooming up. One of the interesting contrasts that one might work is not worry about Iran or the Shah, but talk about the difference between Canada and the United States. In Canada, when they do polls, they find out that over 90% of the people feel good about their health insurance program, health insurance system. You have a conservative government in Canada, conservative, right-wing government that comes in, does not attempt to change one part of that program because that government understands there'll be a revolt on the part of the people. You do a poll in the United States of America and you say to Americans, how are you feeling about the health care in the United States? People saying, it's off the wall. I can't afford it. I can't afford to go to the doctor. I can't afford insurance. And the polls tell us that the American people are grossly dissatisfied with what's going on. One of the things that I've done lately, if I may give an advertisement for myself, a brief one, is that at the last conference that I attended with the National League of Cities and Towns, we managed, with some other people, to push through a resolution on the part of the National League calling upon the Congress to develop a national health care system. I think that that's the way we have to go. I really don't believe that the United States faces, I know that Ronald Reagan seems to think that starting from Nicaragua there's going to be a drive from the south up through Mexico and an invasion through Texas. I happen not to believe that. I think that when you're dealing with nuclear weapons, and the response that I would make to this gentleman is when you have one country after another country getting nuclear weapons, it is highly unlikely, to my view, although I certainly hope it never happens, that someday, somewhere, for some reason, some lunatic is going to press a button. It seems to me absolutely imperative that the nations of the world, led by the United States and the Soviet Union and the other nuclear powers, begin to sit down and get rid of those weapons and have the guts to finally say that in the era of nuclear weapons, international disputes are going to have to be solved through discussion, through the judiciary, and not through war. War is now an obsolete concept. You can't think about what happened in the 1800s or the early 1900s. Then they only killed tens of millions of people in war. Now you're talking about the entire planet. We've got to end war.
Bernie Sanders is mayor of Burlington, Vermont. Thank you for coming and spending some time to talk to our viewers this evening.
My pleasure, and thank you.
Thanks for your questions. Have a good evening.